Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 59. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander, and the Final Four is set. We got a bunch of blue bloods. We got Villanova, we got Kansas, and we got UNC and Duke. The Coach K farewell tour continues, and it's always funny because as quickly as March Madness comes, it seems to go by so quickly as well. But yet, here we are. We'll get to our Final Four breakdown and recap of the weekend that was in March Madness. But first, be a pro and win with DRF Sports Pro. Introducing DRF Sports all-new premium data feature on drf.com/sports. For $99 a year, which is just $8.25 a month, you can get industry-leading betting trends, angles, and analytics. With the madness here, it's the best way for you to make some money this March and have fun while doing it. Again, that's DRF Sports Pro. Sign up now at drf.com/sports. And hopefully we'll keep up the pro picks as well. As mentioned, 4 teams left. So much to break down. We'll also deep dive into some NHL numbers, all that and more. My guy, Matt Russell, joins the show right about now. And we are finally down to the final 4 teams in the NCAA tournament. The madness was hot and heavy. Although the Elite Eight didn't live up to its hype, we are still here to bring said madness to the equation. My guy, Matt Russell, is here to break it all down. There are 4 teams left. A lot of blue bloods alive. How do you feel about the Final Four? How's your bracket, let's say?
Well, listen, we know the bracket died a harsh death on that first night, but the bracket's actually been relatively good outside of that. And yeah, you're right, man. Like, I was looking forward to this round, even like mid-season. I'm like, you know what's going to be sweet? The Elite Eight. Like, that's going to be a great round. Like, we have, any combination of 8 teams is probably going to be pretty good. Now, I mean, listen, let's get right to what everybody's talking about, though, Shal. Like, forget about all this. Like, have you ever seen anything like you saw yesterday? Out of nowhere. I don't know. Listen, it's hard for me to be stunned. I know I was stunned. It's live television. As you know, anything can happen. On the biggest stage, millions watching, to get slapped like that. I mean, the North Carolina Tar Heels did not need to go at St. Peter's like that. It just seemed harsh to me. But I don't know. Maybe the Peacocks had it coming. Shell. I don't know.
I mean, if our guy Shaheem was going a little hard, he was talking a little tough talk. If you go back a couple games, so maybe that was it, right? You talk a little too tough, and karma comes back around, slaps you in the face, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, St. Peter's and shouts to the guys on the college sports podcast. We jumped on with them on Saturday, and we talked about how, good job, good effort, St. Peter's, but your run was about to be over.
You called it, man. You looked right into that camera, and you're like, North Carolina is going to beat the brakes off of St. Peter's tomorrow. That was spectacular. I didn't want anything to do with that game, man. I ran to the hills. I'm like, you know what? I've seen enough. I'm not getting in the way of whatever is about to happen here. I went out. I had a couple of beers. I had some wings. I barely watched. I barely sort of paid attention to the game. Didn't really need to after the first 5 minutes because, I mean, they really did get absolutely trucked, which – you look at these games and, we talked about it, you mentioned on Saturday, but you and I have talked about it on the podcast before where it's like, that first game against Kentucky, that had all the makings of flukiness, right? And again, we talked about the shot quality element. And then the next game against Murray State, that was a really well-played game by St. Peter's, right? And so you get fluke, well-played game, and then you get Purdue doing Purdue things in the Sweet 16, right? And again, the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? Like Matt Painter throwing away another golden opportunity, right? To be able to get into the Final Four. And so, it's sort of, we can win 3 games in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's just kind of sheer flukiness, right? Where I'm not even going to blame Kentucky entirely because again, from a shot quality standpoint, if you play well enough to create shots that is supposed to give you a 20-point victory, you just don't make the shots. And I think we saw this past weekend, right? There wasn't that many games. There was, 4 + 8, there's 12 games. And I swear half of them came down to just who made more shots. Well, that was the situation with Kentucky against St. Peter's a couple of weeks ago, right? Kentucky didn't just make it, just didn't make any shots. St. Peter's made some pretty crazy shots, and they end up sort of surviving, having that will. They didn't panic, all of that sort of thing. And then Murray State, right? St. Peter's was the better team that day. They played a really good game. And if St. Peter's had beaten Murray State in like late November, early December in non-conference play, like it wouldn't even be like on our radar, right? It would just be a blip. We wouldn't really think that much of Murray State. We wouldn't think that lowly of St. Peter's. It would just be like, oh, that's kind of a weird result, right? It wouldn't have been that big of a deal. And then obviously Purdue being kind of a disaster is what that is. And so the fact that North Carolina ran right over St. Peter's, that's the kind of result that's supposed to happen. We made the comparison 98% of the time Kentucky is supposed to win that game. Well, listen, 98% of the time, North Carolina is supposed to win that game against St. Peter's, maybe a little bit less. But honestly, that was just one of the 90 some odd times out of 100 that North Carolina is supposed to win that game. Obviously, you get into blowout territory. North Carolina is playing so incredibly well. But again, whether it's St. Peter's in the first round against Kentucky and the different fork in the road there, or whether it's North Carolina, what if Armando Bacot steps on the out of bounds line? What if that ball lands on the out of bounds line and he doesn't save that back in to Caleb Love, and Caleb Love doesn't hit that three? We could sit around and be like, oh man, UCLA was a bad call, or whatever game was a bad call. Like, that's a 3-point UCLA lead with the ball if, a game of inches, right? If a couple of different things go an inch differently on that one single play after a pretty bad shot by Love in the first place, maybe we're talking about UCLA being in the Final Four, right? And again, that's just another blue blood, because as funny as it is that we have all these upsets and things get crazy. And I kind of think it's the perfect tournament in that way, where you have the upsets and you have the Cinderella run. And then you end up with 4 legitimate teams who you could tell me any one of them is going to win the national title on Monday.
Yeah, and I think the interesting part to me of the East region as a whole, you mentioned the St. Peter's thing, and yeah, the first game against Kentucky, you can look at that as a fluke. Cool. Then by the time they get to Purdue, it's like, okay, well, they at least still have like the athletes for the most part to match up with Purdue. Then once you get to, do you know what I mean? Like the athletes to at least like get on the same court, and like you're not gonna like get run off the floor like you will against North Carolina, who will just out athlete you and have more basketball skill than you, right?
Yeah.
So it was an interesting thing to kind of watch how that region all played out. But again, as you said, for North Carolina to come out of that, yeah, they have the 8 beside their seeds, but it was something you talked about heading into this tournament about how seeding and how like what the seeding is there for, as opposed to what the seeding actually is in reality. But we'll save the matchup of North Carolina region. We know we'll kind of bypass that for now, because there's a lot more I want to say about their matchup in the Final Four. Mm-hmm. We'll go to the South for a sec, and Villanova does it again. And, we were kind of wondering about who would come out of that region. And we know there's a lot of talk about Houston. Houston had a really good run. And, you look at, to me, you look at that Houston Villanova matchup, and Nova, they're just a solid team. Don't really make mistakes. They don't turn the ball over. They move the ball. And that's the way you're going to beat Houston, right? Like that was the only way a team was going to beat Houston. Sure. But how did you see that side of the region break down as Villanova comes out with the victory 50-44 over Houston?
Yeah, listen, I mean, my claim to fame, you obviously called the St. Peter's destruction accurately on Saturday on the live stream. My claim to fame was, the guys, and listen, I was on Houston game 1, I was on Houston game 2, I was on Houston game 3, but sometimes you just have to kind of get off of that ride when the matchup doesn't really suit, right? And we're talking about Jay Wright as an underdog. And my quote was, I'm just not in the business of fading Jay Wright as an underdog. If you're going to give Jay Wright points, like I'm going to take those points and take my chances. Right. And there's, I saw some outrageous like ATS stat about Villanova in the tournament in the last handful of years. And it's like, he's like 21-6 or something insane like that. And it's like, yeah, maybe just betting on Villanova, no matter the circumstance here, underdog as a favorite, whatever, maybe that's just the right move. That being said, you watch that game against Houston, and it's like, make a shot, right? Like, again, sometimes it just comes down to making shots.
Of course.
And it's 1 out of 20 from 3 for Houston. Like, not a bad three-point shooting team, right? Like, this is a pretty good why am I saying three-pointing over and over again? A pretty good 3-point shooting team. Not a ton of sleep last night with all the excitement. So I just go, okay, like, we can break down the thing and start assigning narratives to all of that sort of thing. And like, I just did it with the whole Jay Wright concept. And like, yeah, it counts to play defense against the 3-pointer, but no one plays 5% defense against the 3-point shot. And like, okay, so there are a couple of them late, maybe a little bit desperate, that sort of thing. I mean, you really felt like at one point in the last minute, they were going to hit one, right? Even to just kind of make it cosmetically a little bit tighter. But even the first 15 that they took, right? If they make 3 out of 15 for 20%, which is obviously a very low percentage, we're talking about a game that was in like 4 or 5 points. And it's the same thing as the Purdue-Texas game. If you had told me that Purdue was going to get 40 more free throw attempts, I'd have bet on Purdue that day. If you had told me that Houston was going to go 1 for 20 from the 3-point line, I'd have bet on Villanova that day. And I didn't bet on Villanova. I didn't bet on Houston. And it's funny because, again, claim to fame here, pats on the back, etc. I literally on the live show pointed out the exact correct moment to bet Houston live. That was going to be my angle because the last 10 minutes for Houston have been so strong. We talked about this before the game against Arizona, right? And that's what happened too. That game was tight, 10 minutes to go. Houston just blows them away. Now, obviously, you get into a different spot where that game wasn't, tied with 10 minutes to go, or I said in the under 12 timeout. But, Houston does have that push late. And that's what happened. You're able to grab them plus 7.5. I tweeted it out. Everybody had more than ample time, if you're following along on Twitter, to be able to get in on that, right? Sometimes live betting, and we talk about it frequently, is really hard to sort of tell people what to do in advance, or to, tweet it out and hope the line is still available and it doesn't change because, obviously there's a lag time element, not just on the broadcast, but on obviously reading tweets, going to your book, live betting it. In this case, we did have a couple of minutes in order to do so, but like, I talked about it on the stream on Saturday, like 10 minutes to go in the under 12 timeout, look to bet Houston live. Now that almost got dicey at the end because Villanova is such a good free throw shooting team, which is why I wanted to wait. You get into that position. It's one thing if it's tied and I'm just going to bet on Houston to win the game outright, which was actually the intent. It's another thing if they are losing and you now have to factor in Villanova's free throw shooting in the way that we were able to cash with Villanova against Michigan on Thursday, right? We knew that free throw shooting was going to be a problem late. And as close as that game was, 4-point game with about a minute to go ish, you knew that Villanova was going to make all their free throws. So it was just going to be a matter of how many threes Michigan could make. And they obviously couldn't. And so it's obviously a different deal. I'm like 7.5. That feels like it's just out of the range of like, you're not going to have to worry about the free throw shooting late. But we were one missed Houston shot and, or turnover away from Villanova getting the ball, getting fouled again, and probably hitting another free throw because, as much as we talk about the 3-point line, Houston didn't make very many of their free throws and Villanova made every single one of theirs. And when we're talking about a game whose total was under 100 points, man, we talk sometimes up every point matters in college basketball, especially when it's under 100 points. Obviously a different story in the NBA. We talk about that all the time when you're talking 240 point totals. That live total was 99.5 with like a good chunk of that game left. And I'm like, that's really stark to actually see on your odds board. I'm sure it happens all the time. And I'm not paying that much attention. I'm sure Virginia games are probably in the 90s all the time, but man, like that was pretty wild. So I mean, sometimes it just comes down to shot making, man, and you can't go 1 of 20 from 3 and expect to win. As good as that Houston team was and is and probably will be, right? Like I'll back Kelvin Sampson again, probably on them next year when we have these same conversations about ratings versus resume and seeding versus how good you are and all that sort of thing. But I mean, Villanova with Gillespie, and obviously now they've got the injury to Moore, and that's going to be a big deal come this Saturday, presumably. But Villanova deserves to be in the Final Four. Certainly one of 5 teams that, if that was the cool part about the South, right? One of those 5 teams, those top 5 seeds, were going to make it out of the South, and you'd be content with any one of them.
Yeah, and their matchup in the Final Four, you land Kansas, who you've talked about being on since the start of the season, and we talked, Kansas kind of had an interesting path that it would take. You could easily see them making it to said Final Four. They end up running into a Miami team, and I mean, I guess Miami ran into them and lost essentially, but Kansas gets through. Just the way that kind of played out, it was pretty as advertised. If you were listening to the pod anyways, I'd like to say.
Yeah, it's one of those deals where it's like, yeah, I mean, everybody talked about the path for Kansas, but it's also Kansas. But again, you could fill in that blank and put a lot of teams in there as far as teams that you don't trust or teams that you might think might screw up a really sort of comfortable path. Kansas has done this before. And then they actually do make it through. And you're just sort of like, oh, okay, everything kind of went according to plan. Obviously, the only one seed to make it through, which if you're talking path, and again, matchups matter. You always talk about styles make fights, right? Kansas doesn't have to deal with Iowa and the potential to get outscored by Iowa because Kansas' defense is like meh at best. They don't have to deal with that. And the Providence game was kind of exactly what we thought, right? Scrappy Providence, don't really want anything to do with a point spread like that. And certainly through half, right? Miami's up 6 points at halftime. And I'm sitting there, I've got that was my only bet in the Elite Eight, was plus 6.5 with Miami. I talked about on the live stream because, as much as I have this big future from the start of the season on Kansas, like the reality is I don't trust them to cover a large spread. Now they go out and they have the half of their lives against Miami in that second half. Like that was wild. And like, nobody saw that coming. I can't imagine, right? Where you're sitting there, I'm just like, this Kansas team, like they have all the pieces, but like McCormick is only playing kind of 4 minutes at a time. And there's just altogether way too much Mitch Lightfoot in my life. And you know what I mean? Like Obadji was out of the game against Providence for like an extended period of time. And like when he's not out there, you're wondering what's going on. And even in the first half, he's out there, but we're getting a lot of 3-pointers jacked up from other guys from Kansas. And like, I don't know if Bill Self went in and just had the speech of a lifetime, or if there was some sort of adjustment, or maybe just Miami's offense that was running almost entirely through long twos from Cameron McGusty, right? Like my guy was hitting over 50% on like contested long twos. Like that wasn't going to sustain, but like from it to go from 6 to like a 20-point lead, man, like that was quick. And so you go, and it's funny how, even people who like myself who preach about not overreacting to a game or whatever, I'm overreacting to the half. I'm like, oh, like even if Kansas comes back and wins, like they're going to get beat by Villanova. But then you watch that second half and you're like, okay, maybe Kansas is this wagon that we're looking for. And obviously the more injury for Villanova hurts them as well. And it's why you're seeing a point spread up in the neighborhood of 4 for this game coming up on Saturday. But yeah, I mean, again, like it feels easy when you look back and you go, okay, Miami, Providence, nobody really liked them. Creighton without 2 of their best players, right? Like it's this comfortable journey that of course that happened, but like that's not usually how this all works, right? But yeah, again, they were favored to get through pretty handily, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, talk about how like I always try to like, gauge a lot of these programs that we see year in and year out. And Kansas is just always a team that I can't tie down. Like, I think I talked about it on the preview of this pod. Like every year, if they're supposed to be really good, I'm like, okay, fade. Every time they're supposed to be like, okay, I don't ride with Kansas. And then that's the year they make the run. And maybe this game sums that up the most, because like, how do you rate this team coming off this game? Right. Cause like the second half, for you to outscore a team, what was it? 47-15 in the second half. Right. Like that doesn't make sense. Like that doesn't seem like it's real, right? No. You shoot 16 for 27 after the break compared to 6 for 28, right? That is what Miami shot. Plus the out rebounding margin in the last 20 minutes, 25-11 for Kansas. That's like, so you're talking rebounding, shooting, scoring, like that's a completely different team. Yeah. Right. So I don't know. Kansas, I never have a good grasp of Kansas. I don't really know Bill Self. I'm sure you're a pretty good coach, obviously. Like you're a good coach, right? Right. But like Kansas, again, I have no idea what to make of Kansas on a year in, year out basis. And this game just showed I have no idea how to rate Kansas from one half to the next.
It's kind of like it took him 20 minutes to realize that Miami has no real rim protection. And this idea that like, okay, if we can just get past sort of the first layer of defense and like the help defense that comes and we can and sort of scheme around that where we can get our athletes to the rim, that there's not going to be anybody there to block. Like Wardenberg had a couple of blocks that frankly felt a little, I don't want to say lucky, but like right place at the right timey type of a situation, right? And again, especially when it's Mitch Lightfoot working the low block, right? Like that's going to make Miami's rim defense going to look a little bit better, right? And it's like, okay, well, how about instead we make a point to get Abaji the ball, or even Jalen Wilson the ball, like at and around the rim, or find ways to get our guards taking the ball to the rim, because there really isn't that many guys who are going to be able to stop us. And I think that's part of it. Obviously, the rebounding edge comes from, in a lot of cases, Miami kind of just, I don't want to say giving up towards the end of the game, but like that flipped so quick. Where it's like, oh man, we're down 12, 5 minutes into like the second half. Like, yeah, okay, we're probably not going to reel this thing back in. So, I mean, the writing was on the wall from that standpoint, but, plus 6.5 closes plus 5.5, and you have a 6-point lead outright, right? You have a 12.5 point lead. Like, you're loving that bet. That's a really good bet. So, again, I don't want to say that was a hedge. I said on Saturday that wasn't a hedge on my futures. This was literally just, I would make this bet. I would make even a Miami money line bet beforehand. I would be feeling really good about that at halftime. And then, of course, Kansas plays, again, the half of their lives, and we'll see if they're able to not necessarily replicate that coming this week, but whether it's maybe that's the best we're ever going to see Kansas, but hopefully for the case of my futures bet, that we see a lot more of that coming this Saturday and Monday.
I can't lie. I feel in a very tough position overall because there's part of me that wants Kansas to because Villanova's injured and banged up. I'm assuming Kansas should win convincingly. Maybe not we'll get to the actual preview numbers. But if I'm saying I think Kansas will win against Villanova, I'm now looking forward to thinking I need Kansas to look really good because we just cannot have Duke win. Okay. Which leads us to the West region of the bracket. And I mean, here's the thing, right? We could start with Gonzaga going down because I know that's a thing
we have to
haven't gotten to yet, because we're talking about teams to take out Duke. If I look at it, I don't really rate Kansas, so I feel icky even hoping for that. Gonzaga, we know I'm not really on that train at all, but they were part of our program that as a team that we hope could have knocked out Duke. Yeah. And Gonzaga doesn't even get there. They go down to Arkansas 74-68. And, I know I'm leading the charge here on this program talking about fading Gonzaga every time they play quote unquote a real team, but couldn't you have just lasted one more round, Gonzaga? Giving us just one more game? What happened to the Zags? And
I know, right? I mean, listen, we talked about it on Saturday, man. This tournament's really hard, and everybody focuses on Gonzaga because they're this hot button thing, and everybody I think wants to watch Gonzaga more during certainly the late stages of the regular season, right? You have ample opportunity in conference play or in non-conference play, to watch them, though. I mean, there was some sketchy start times. I think you and I talked about the Duke Gonzaga game starting at 11 o'clock or something. Mm-hmm. When that happened, it was a Friday in November or early December. I'm like, I'd love to watch this game, but who else is going to watch this game with me, right? And we talk about how they play Texas and Alabama and Duke all in the same week, so they're trying their hardest to make the schedule better. The problem is football rules the world, right? Especially in North America, certainly in the United States. And Gonzaga doesn't have a football team, so they're not going to get into the Pac-12. I'm sorry, it's not going to happen unless we really start moving some stuff around here and make some concessions. I mean, you would think, but at the same time, right? Okay, let me just take a quick look at how many Pac-12 teams are in the Final Four. 0. Okay, let me do another quick look on when the last time a Pac-12 team won a national title. That's 25 years ago, all right? And it's okay, Pac-12 stinks. Why couldn't they play in the Big Ten? It's the same Big Ten that hasn't won a title since 2000 with Mateen Cleaves, right? Come on. So, you know what I mean? The Big Ten and the Pac-12, they aren't doing anything for the UCLAs and Arizonas of the world as far as pushing them into a title. And Gonzaga has won the most tournament games, and that will probably be, I haven't checked the latest stats on this, but that will probably be the case after this year's tournament. That'll probably be the case after next year's tournament, because guess what? They'll probably be really good again. And like, yeah, you're going to be right a lot of the time when you're trying to say like, okay, this team's not going to win a tournament, or this team's never going to win a tournament. And maybe they never do, right? But if you had told me 20 years ago that the Big Ten, the entire Big Ten, 14 teams, and maybe we take out Northwestern, 13 teams who have a chance in theory to win a title, none of them are going to win. And then we throw in the Pac-12. And so we add, now we're up to 25 teams that you get, and any one of them wins a title, and you're correct, but 25 teams fail for 25 years. And Gonzaga's the one that we have a problem with.
Yes.
Like, what are we talking about here? Right. And so like, yeah, and so it's low hanging fruit. It's easy to be right. Again, I talked about this before. Like, I sat there in Phoenix, in Glendale, Arizona in 2017, and I watched the referees absolutely rob Gonzaga of a title against that North Carolina team that day. And so like, I'm not going to beat them up about not winning a title. That being said, this is a gambling podcast. This is what we talk about. 0-3 against the spread in this tournament. Great. You and I faded them every single time along the way. And so that worked out nicely for us, because we keep, I keep my ratings. I've talked all year about, okay, we're going to fade Gonzaga at BYU, at St. Mary's, at San Francisco, because this line is 3 points too high. This line is 4 points too high. But it doesn't matter as much in those games, because they have the depth to sort of wear down those opponents in the WCC in the same way that they would wear down a ton of different opponents in the tournament. And they do. That's how they made 2 finals, right? Obviously a couple of Final Fours. The problem is, when they face an SEC team that's well coached, on full preparation, 4 or 5 days, and has, sort of the ability to play defense against that team, then it becomes a sort of 50-50 shot type of a deal, right? And were some of those calls against Holmgren kind of sketch? Sure. But you know what? Gonzaga got all the calls against Memphis, right? Like, Memphis, another team that you're not going to have them wear down. You might foul them out, right? And that, either has more to do with the officiating or more to do with the style of play. That's up for other people to determine. But there's a handful of teams, man. That's, it's why we look at it and we go, wow, there's 15 to 16 teams that could win this. And I don't even know that North Carolina was on a ton of people's list 2 weeks ago. They're certainly they should certainly be on everybody's list now. They're certainly on my list now. And so you just look at it and you go, okay, whether or not Memphis or North Carolina, we thought they could win the tournament, we knew teams like that were talent-wise, were capable of beating any one of these quote-unquote top teams. And it was never that Gonzaga was invincible. It was just that, you know what, this is probably the best team, not by some massive margin, and the best team can lose all the time, right? And if we've learned anything from this tournament, which we should learn every year at this tournament, or every year in sports in general, is that upsets happen. Right. And again, to say, if you were watching SEC basketball in the middle of February and I told you that Arkansas was going to knock off Gonzaga, you'd be like, yeah, okay. You know what I mean? Makes a ton of sense, right? In the same way that Alabama did, and in the same way that Kentucky could have, in the same way that Tennessee could have, and in the same way that Auburn, especially when they were playing well early on in the season, could have. And that's just what happens, right? And so, yeah, from a day-to-day, game-to-game thing, yes, the value was fading Gonzaga. But the idea that, like, okay, just wrap the program because they didn't win the championship is just an absolutely, like, wacky sentiment in a sport that is one and done from a tournament standpoint, and that has 300 teams, 300 plus teams, and certainly 50 to 60 of them from a program standpoint that kind of rotate through the Final Four, right? Like if you did what's the Sporkle, right? Sporkle.com, and hit like Final Four, every Final Four team of the last 25 years, the list is probably 50 to 60 deep, because you never know who's going to pop up from a, school standpoint. And so the fact that Gonzaga continually pops up and is continually the best team metrically, listen, I mean, Houston proved all they needed to prove when it came to how important measuring a team metrically is, because again, they hit a couple more threes. We're talking about them in the Final Four, right? Maybe Arkansas doesn't even survive Vermont. And now, Gonzaga would have absolutely hammered Vermont. And then I think Gonzaga would have hammered Duke. I don't know, maybe not hammered, but certainly potentially have beaten them, right? It's a thin line. And that's the thing, whether we're talking NFL, basketball, whatever, we'll get to hockey, all of that sort of thing. Thin line, man. It's a thin line. And so when it comes to Gonzaga, yeah, we're happy to cash the, 3-0 fading them against the spread this postseason. But, again, I'm not going to beat them up for not winning a tournament that's really, really hard to win.
Yeah. I think my thing is like Gonzaga for so long, it was an overcorrection from mid-majors need to get more love. Big majors need to get more love.
Yeah.
And now it's like, no, but Gonzaga should be a number 1 seed every year. They're like Duke. They're like this team. They're like that team. It's like, nah, they're like Wisconsin. It's like if we put Wisconsin in their bracket, in their
and we talked about this on Saturday, right?
Like if we put Wisconsin in their conference, we'd be like, yo, Wisconsin's dope. And it's like, no, they're not. They're just a Big Ten team.
I mean, isn't St. Mary's Wisconsin though? Right? Like every year, Wisconsin and St. Mary's play almost the exact same like tempo, the exact same metrics, right?
Yeah,
so I think we are
sucks.
And it's totally sucks. But I'm saying like at least I feel like we do see Wisconsin. They're just in the shape and wearing the jerseys of St. Mary's, right? And if you took Gonzaga and you put them in the Big Ten, like, yeah, they're probably sharing the title with Illinois and Purdue, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't hear anybody talking about Illinois' failures of the last 2 years. I don't hear, and I mean, we're talking about Purdue's failures or whatever. Same thing with, obviously the SEC, right? Total flame out.
For sure.
Everybody talked all year about the ACC being trash this year. Mm-hmm. They were a Miami second half absolute destruction collapse away from having 3 teams in the Final Four, right? Like we're all just kind of making this stuff up in a lot of ways, right? And so when it comes to Gonzaga, you and I talked about it. Like I brought up, the Canadian contingent of Kevin Pangos and Kelly Olynyk, right? When those teams were getting number 1 seeds, right? And obviously Adam Morrison, another guy that I left off the list on Saturday as far as like, okay, yes, when your best player is Adam Morrison and you're getting the like number 1 seed overall or whatever, or your best player is Kelly Olynyk and you're getting a number 1 seed overall because you're rolling through the West Coast Conference and you're at that time are not playing that much of a non-conference schedule because, by the way, people didn't want to play Gonzaga. Right. And so like things change. Right. So in 2010, I'll just use a random example. Right. It was viewed as like, why would we ever play Gonzaga? We're not going to get credit for a non-conference win against a Big Ten school, an SEC school. Why would we ever play Gonzaga? That doesn't make any sense. If we lose, we're going to get made fun of for losing to small Gonzaga out in Spokane. If we win, who cares? We were supposed to beat Gonzaga. Now they end up building up the program, which is what you're supposed to do. And then they end up getting the top recruits, right? They get the Zach Collinses of the world, right? Who obviously injury issues kind of derailed his career in a lot of ways from a pro standpoint, but a guy who was a top 10 pick, right? Obviously more recently, Jalen Suggs and now Chet Holmgren. Right? And so now you're in that echelon only in the last 5 years or so, where you're in that echelon of where you're competing for recruits with the Dukes and the Texases and the Kentuckys and like these schools, right? And like, what does Texas ever do with the like literal, like once a year, every year, first round pick? And you go like, well, what did they do in the tournament? Nothing. And you know what I mean? And like, it's just funny because we all look at Gonzaga as this thing because like, yeah, they get the 1 seed every year. And maybe if they play in a bigger conference and they have a couple more losses, but like Kansas had a handful of losses this year. Baylor had a handful of losses this year. They got number 1 seeds. Even Arizona obviously had a few losses. So like, yeah, I'll throw a couple extra losses on Gonzaga's resume on a year-to-year basis, but like there's still going to be a 2 or a 1 in that conversation. And honestly, as much as everybody talks about the 1 seed, like it doesn't matter whether you're a 1 or a 2 seed. Like geographically, sometimes, obviously, Duke ideally didn't necessarily want to go play in the West, but you're only doing that for 1 weekend because guess what? Duke played in the Carolinas. I think it was like Greenville, Carolina, in the first and second round, and they're going to the Final Four location, which obviously has nothing to do with region, for the Final Four. So, like, I'm sorry you had to make 1 trip out west to San Francisco, Coach K. Like, bummer, right? So like other than that, like being a 1 or a 2 doesn't really matter, right? But because people gravitate to being bummed out about Gonzaga getting a 1 seed as if like any other team deserves it, right? Like, well, we needed Auburn to get a 1 seed, we needed Duke to get a 1 seed. Like, no, I mean, again, congratulations Villanova and Duke for being 2 seeds that made the Final Four. But like, no, we didn't need those teams to be 1 seed. There was nothing about those teams' resume. I mean, Duke hasn't played a true road game since the Reagan administration at this point, right? But they'll schedule some, neutral site games. We see them in the Champions Classic in like Chicago or MSG or something along those lines. We go, oh man, they played Kansas to start the year. But it's like they never go to anybody's road or arena until they hit ACC play, when they have to go on the road, and then they pick up 3 or 4 losses on the road, and they end up 26-4, 27-6, something along those lines, right? Like they'll play a road game in the Big Ten ACC Challenge every 2 years, and sometimes it's against a not even particularly good team. And so I just throw my hands in the air and I just like, okay, like fine. Right. And we always talk about how like Duke gets the advantage when it comes to officiating and all of that sort of thing. And again, if Gonzaga had any even Steven officiating in 2017, none of this is even ever happening, right? Because Zach Collins gets to play more than 11 minutes, and it's not Shemek Kronowski or whatever his name was playing an alarming amount of time and hoping that Nigel Williams-Goss leads them to victory because their best player gets fouled out. Like, we don't have this conversation because everybody just goes, well, they won in 2017. Or maybe Baylor trips and falls last year and they get to play anybody other than Baylor in the final, right? And then we don't have this conversation, right? And so, like, again, thin lines, man, thin lines. And when it comes to betting and sports in general, I think people just forget that there's a really thin line with this stuff.
Yeah, you're right. You're completely right. We'll never know. And all we know as of this point is that Gonzaga is overrated in college basketball. They haven't won, and they haven't really produced that great of NBA players either. But all of those
but again, the talent coming in, right, matters. The talent in a universe where you only get to play 1 season if you're good, right, before you go on to the NBA, right? I mean, for sure. Yeah, we're talking like 3 players that they've had that were top, 20 recruits, right? So I mean, that stuff matters. Yeah.
It's been an interesting turn for sure. I will say though, I'm not surprised that Jalen Suggs is not good in the NBA. Story for another day. We'll say
the jury has received the verdict already, everyone.
It's a great draft class. I'm just saying,
it's a good draft.
A lot of other dudes in the draft class have figured out a way to,
you know what though, man, but situation matters, right? Like, he would be better if he was on the Raptors, a really good, strong organization that knew exactly what they wanted with Scotty Barnes and knew exactly how to use Scotty Barnes. Mm-hmm. And that's why they took Scotty Barnes over Jalen Suggs. Sure. If Scotty Barnes isn't available there, Jalen Suggs is probably the pick, and they're able to do, they'll have him do different things than Scotty Barnes does. And maybe it's not as good as how Scotty Barnes looks, but it's certainly probably better than the Orlando version of Jalen Suggs, because guess what? The anybody other than Orlando version of anybody is better than the Orlando version of that person, right? Like, we know this about the NBA, right? Mm-hmm. So again, like, a guy goes to, you watch the draft, a guy goes to Sacramento, and you're just like, well, he had a good ride.
Sure.
It's all
for sure. But we're still talking about like Detroit's and Houston's and Cleveland's, right? Like, we're not really talking about like great places besides the Raptors. But anyways, doesn't matter. This is a different pod. We'll get to our NBA draft pod at some point. As mentioned, Gonzaga not around to take on Duke. Duke ends up dominating Arkansas. That game wasn't even close. I wonder though, I look at this Duke matchup now, and we'll do the full preview, like going forward into the actual Final Four matchup. But in terms of Duke winning the West, did we kind of run into a situation where you had a lot of people trying to figure out how to knock off Duke instead of just accepting the Coach K farewell tour for what it was, that he was going to make the Final Four?
I mean, yeah. Again, it's sort of funny, right? How the world sort of flips, because, and especially with this region, we talk about the bracket and like, how's your bracket? And like, yeah, I had Kansas going to get into the Final Four. I had Duke getting to the Final Four. And it's like, okay, how are we assigning the sort of value to these teams from a bracket standpoint, right? Because like, as much as like, we're like, oh man, fade Gonzaga, they're overrated. Like, obviously that's the conversation with Duke on an annual basis, like people trying to find ways to like discredit Duke. The defense is terrible, right? Like the title they won, I think it was like 2015. They had like one of the worst defenses they'd ever had leading up into that tournament. Then all of a sudden, guess what? Like they end up, beating your Wisconsin Badgers you like so much, because they played better defense in that tournament. And like, yeah, is the defense great? Like maybe not, but like they still have, depending on your point of view, they have somewhere in between 3 and 6 NBA basketball players, like future NBA players on the team. And it's like, yeah, that might be a big deal, right? Like that might be a big deal when it comes to the last 5 minutes against Michigan State. That might be a big deal when it comes to the last 8 minutes where they do not miss a shot against Texas Tech. A Texas Tech defense that, like, for my money, like line them up, like maybe Nova is comparable, right? But like if I wanted a team to stop someone or force a bad shot, or force a missed shot, get a stop, like Texas Tech would be on that list. Not a team I'm looking to get a ton of scoring out of, but from a defensive standpoint, like, yeah, Texas Tech is it when it comes to college basketball. And so it's like, we talked about the percentages, like as much as we go like, yeah, Gonzaga, like overrated, nobody's going to have them like winning. It's like, well, 37% had Gonzaga atop their bracket. And you and I talked about how, like, think about that. If you're in a 100-person pool, you are now competing still against 37 other people. If you're picking Gonzaga to win outright, you need Gonzaga to win outright and you need to beat 37 other people. Like it doesn't make any sense, right? Whether they win or lose, it's a bad play to make. Then you look at the Duke side of things and you go like, man, only like 7% of people have Duke winning, and only like, I think it was like 15 to 20% had them making the Final Four. And obviously that's because of Gonzaga's existence, and obviously because of Texas Tech is, again, that was a dead even point spread. That was a game that was within a point or two for like the whole second half, right? Like that's a closely lined game for a reason. Those two teams are pretty even, right? And obviously Duke comes out on top. So like, I get why maybe not everybody's piling into Duke this year, but at the same time, if we're just asking them to get to the Final Four at a 15% sort of popularity level, yeah, I'm going to do that, because again, definitely 3 NBA players and then maybe 3 more, again, depending on how you feel about like the Wendell Moores and the, and some of the guards, right? Keels and who's the one I'm missing? Oh, Roach. So yeah, really good team, but guess what, right? They're going up against another team that has a ton of potential NBA talent, because would you be surprised against the Tar Heels, if you end up seeing Baycott, Davis, Love in the NBA, right? We might have 3 NBA players on both teams coming up with this matchup, right? And so, yeah, Arkansas never really stood a chance. There wasn't anything nefarious going on, right? That was a game that, and I'll sort of bring this up from a sort of betting tip standpoint, right? And this is, bookmark this one. It's a real beaut. The difference between hedging a future and using a future to set up a good bet, right? So you make futures obviously based on price. Okay, I think this is going to happen more likely than the market does. So in the middle of the season, February-ish, I see a market that is, I think, mispriced, and it's Arkansas 18-1 to make the Final Four, not to win the title, just to make the Final Four, i.e. win the region. It's middle of the season. We don't know what region they're going to be in. We don't know what their matchups are, right? So we obviously have to play that game a little bit. So I make that bet. Selection Sunday rolls around. Hey, Arkansas, you're in the Duke, Texas Tech, and Gonzaga region. And by the way, your second round matchup is against UConn, obviously a team, a program that's dangerous to move on at any given time. Okay, that's not great. All right, I guess that bet has lost its value entirely. But what happens is they edge New Mexico State and they edge Vermont, and you find yourself going like, okay, I mean, they're probably not going to beat Gonzaga. And they knock off Gonzaga. You go, okay. I hadn't really thought of this bet at all. There was no sort of hedge to make, because I think they were about 12 or 13-1 once the bracket came out. So there was some small amounts of value, but not enough. And so a lot of people will just hedge the bet, and they'll sit and they'll go, okay, I'm going to bet a little on Duke here so that I can get my money back, or I can get a unit or two out of this. And I'm free rolling Arkansas for an upset. And the line was only 4, which meant the money line was only about minus 170, got up to minus 180 as high as it possibly got, I think. But if you're going to hedge, okay, that's fine. But like, you have to still have some belief in Arkansas winning that game relative to the price that you're getting. And so I could have just free rolled that. But instead, I'm like, Duke is going to win this game. Like, congrats to Arkansas for beating Gonzaga. But Duke is going to match up. Obviously, the time to prepare for Musselman isn't the same against Gonzaga as it is Duke. Obviously, the talent level that Arkansas can bring is somewhat, you can match Gonzaga from a talent level. And I don't think you can match Duke from a talent level with the NBA talent that's on that team that we just talked about. So I instead go, okay, this bet that is, going to earn me 18 units if Arkansas wins. Okay, that's a decent bet. But how about instead, I take the money that I would win if Arkansas does win. And I just take all of that, and maybe a little bit extra, but just take all of that and put that all on Duke, on the Duke money line, right? Because if you're taking 18 units and putting that on the Duke money line, you're going to win back 10 units. Right? On a minus 180 money line. Well, if I've only put 1 unit down on Arkansas in the first place, I'm now netting 9 units. So going into that game, which would you rather have? Duke to, essentially free rolling Duke to win 9 units, or Arkansas to win 18 units? Yeah. Right. And like, that's a decent question because like, yeah, okay, 18 is obviously double the amount and all, and you're getting sort of plus 200, whatever. Like, no. I think Duke is going to win this game. And so I was never going to bet the Duke money line for 10 units otherwise, but I had this futures thing that allowed me to make a better bet. And I felt in that time that Duke was the better bet than Arkansas. And it's not going back on what my bet was. My bet from back in February was, I think Arkansas is valuable at 18-1 to win whatever region they end up getting into. Right. And that ended up being true. And so I won the bet once Arkansas made the regional final. It was just, okay, am I going to keep letting this ride on Arkansas? Am I going to take a little of Duke just to make sure that I'm free rolling Arkansas? Or am I going to come over the top and bet on Duke here? Because that's my bet for this game. I think Duke is going to win. Don't worry about the point spread. None of that matters when it comes to obviously futures prices or money lines. That's how you create a bet from a futures bet. So you get a lot of people talking about hedging. Oh, I got this big bet. I got this big payout, blah, blah, blah. I want to hedge it, want to hedge it, want to hedge it. And listen, if we're talking about $20,000, $30,000, some crazy thing, maybe I'm rocking a St. Peter's $100, 10,000-1 bet, that, something along those lines, where you can't come over the top of that. And your move is to hedge sort of as best you possibly can. That's obviously a different story. But when we're talking about sort of smaller level things here with like 18-1s, create yourself a bet. Don't marry yourself to an Arkansas to win the region thing that you made back in February. In the same way that once we get to the national title game, if we're talking Duke, Kansas, a week from now, I'm not super sure I'm going to be rolling into that game needing Kansas. I may come over the top on Duke in that situation, or North Carolina for that matter, right? It's going to depend on sort of how I value both those teams and how I value what I can get out of that bet. So anyway, just a little bit of a tip there in sort of a best example that I can possibly give that is obviously in the immediate, that you don't have to hedge. Sometimes you can come over the top and get off that ticket entirely. And sometimes that's the better bet. Now, if Arkansas had went and knocked off Duke in that game, I'd be rattled that I gave up a shot at an 18-1, but I'd take 9-1 on Duke to beat Arkansas anytime.
Oh, for sure. And you talked about getting good tips and hopefully followed some of the tips so far as we were able to now see a Final Four picture that has Villanova, Kansas, Duke, and North Carolina. We will hit you up with a full preview that will come out on Thursday on this podcast feed that will get you set for Final Four weekend. And then, of course, I guess maybe next week we'll figure that out. We'll probably come back maybe after the final, like the actual.
Well, we got to
do Monday night.
championship Monday. So we'll talk about that on Monday morning next week. That'll be fun.
Yeah. So we'll hit that up for sure. Something we've been trying to talk about for a while kind of ended up being the Matt Damon to our Jimmy Kimmel,
yeah.
But the NHL, and as we have some time here at the end of this pod, kind of want to clear the floor and give a little intro into your thoughts on some NHL betting.
Yeah. Let's sort of catch up on this season a little bit and talk about kind of the next month plus here as we get to the playoffs. Now, normally the NHL playoffs start kind of mid-April, right? Obviously, different issues this year have pushed that back. We're another year where the playoffs are going to start late, and obviously they're going to run a lot later. So a little summary on this season so far. Up until the All-Star break, the NHL was not bettable. Not bettable under any circumstances, right? Because of the COVID issues and like testing and people being out and you not knowing, okay, you might know who was going to be out of the lineup, right? You might know, oh, this guy's out. I mean, you'd have to be like really tracking it to know, okay, this guy's out for 5 days. Okay, what does that mean? He's going to miss 2 games. Is he going to miss 3 games? Is he going to be back on Tuesday? Is he not? What's going to be the deal there? But more importantly, even if you knew X, Y, and Z is not going to be in the lineup, how do you value that? Right? How do you value that on the money line? Like, it's impossible to do. Like, what does, John, we'll use a Toronto example here. What does John Tavares, Austin Matthews, and Mitch Marner, like if those guys weren't in the lineup, like, yeah, Toronto's going to be the underdog to whomever they play, who probably have a full lineup, but by how much? Is plus 200 enough? Is plus 300 enough for you to bet on that lineup? Plus 400? Somewhere, anywhere in between? Like what, where do you actually value those guys? Shell, like it's impossible to do so, right? Like you're chuckling there because you're like, yeah, you don't want to see that. You don't want to bet on that game. You don't want, and on the flip side, like, are you in a hockey game where there's NHL players, like some of them, again, maybe more replacement than those star players, but like, are you dying to lay minus 400 on the Leafs opponent in that circumstance? No. Are you dying to lay minus 500 on the Leafs when they're facing a team that doesn't have their 3 best players or their starting goalie or something along those lines? Probably not, because it's hockey and it's weird and the puck goes a variety of different locations that you wouldn't expect. Like you would never do that. So like you could not make a bet on the NHL with like any kind of confidence before the All-Star break. And then what happens at the All-Star break? They stop testing. And now you actually know who's going to play. And so instead of trying to evaluate every single player and what percentage to the win probability they matter, is it 4%? Is it 6%? Is it 8%? We actually get full teams that get to play. And so you're not going to believe what happens, Shell. It becomes profitable. Right? We're able to make bets on value where we get into the creases and that we're going, able to make these bets. Now, again, everybody's doing March Madness, obviously the end of the football season, all of that sort of thing. So I want to get everybody up to speed here because what I do over at The Score is early on in the season, I did a weekly money line guide. Now that's an idea, something to give you an idea of what these prices should be. Now, I will admit, largely useless for a lot of these games because the prices would get all kinds of out of whack because players would be out. We then go, once sort of New Year's and then football season ends, we then go to twice a week. Again, pre-All-Star break, not largely useless, but occasionally useless. And now we're into the post-All-Star break, no testing thing, and it is rolling right now. Maybe not this past weekend because underdogs really took it on the chin harder than Chris Rock did, but we're looking at this from a long-term perspective. And so how I approach betting on the NHL, right? I put a ton of import on even strength, right? Everybody talks about power play. This power play is dangerous. That power play is dangerous. Okay, sure, right? But can you rely on that in a 1-game sample size? I don't believe so. So I take a ton of 5-on-5 metrics into my sort of pot that I mix together. And I just go, okay, if you're the better team 5-on-5 relative to the money line, then like we're going to find an edge there. And so in the NHL, because it's a money line centric sport, the idea is to find 2.5%, 3%, 4%, 5% edges, right? Where over the long period of time, that's going to be valuable. And so a lot of that time is going to be underdogs. And why are underdogs going to be valuable? Because they just inherently are in money line centric sports, because the answer to the trivia question or to the answer every night, or the question every night is, did you win or did you lose? And so people just want to be on the side of the winner, and they want to win 4 out of 5 games. They want to win 4 out of 7 games, even if long-term that might not be the right idea. And so basically what my column on a daily basis now, we're going to a daily column, well, semi-daily, because we'll still do the weekend one that covers the whole weekend. I'm not a robot, is a day in advance. So today is Monday. I will send out a column that has Tuesday's games on it, because Monday night is when lines open in the NHL. Works the same way for the NBA and most of these other sports, college basketball as well. And so you'll know what to look for when lines open the night before, because it's important to get the best of the number. And you and I talk about getting the best of the number all the time. So put it this way. If you bet 4 hockey games a night, right, which is, I would say on average, I mean, there's probably, listen, there's a Saturday where there's a 15 game slate. There's a, Wednesday where there's a bunch of games. Like there's obviously different days where maybe you bet a little bit more games. There are obviously days where there's 4 games and maybe you're only betting 1. But let's say you average 4 games a day for 6 months over the course of a season, right? And you end up, obviously 30 days in a month, you end up probably betting like 700 hockey games, right? Now, I know that's obviously a sort of, excessive example. We talked about college basketball in betting 500 plus games in order to get our 1 or 2% edge over a long period of time. But if you're betting 600-700 games, we'll use 720 as an example. Again, most of those are going to be underdogs because that's where the value lies, because people like betting the favorite. Let's say you go 32 and 400, right? You go 80 games below 500. You are obviously losing more games than you are winning. But if you're jumping on these bets, and let's say your average price, sometimes your price is going to be plus 200. Sometimes your price is going to be minus 140. Maybe, sometimes there's value on a minus 140. If the price should be minus 160, there's value on minus 140. But let's say it all averages out and your average price that you bet is about plus 135, right? And you're getting that number. And so over the course of 720 bets, right, you win 320 of them at plus 135. I'll do some quick math for everybody. That's plus 423, right? And so if your average bet is a 1 unit bet at plus 135, you're making 423, but you've lost 400 bets, right? Good news is you're still up 23 units. So you've gone 320 and 400. You are 80 games below 500. But because your average price that you've bet into was at plus 135, you're up 23 units. Now, Shell, let's say those lines open at plus 135 tonight, for example, right? And you see that game, you go, okay, plus 135, I'm going to bet that. Or you're off doing something else, right? You're having dinner with the wife, et cetera, and you miss it. And it was plus 135, but it gets bet. Because somebody else out there, other people listening to this podcast, for example, other people reading the column are betting it. And the line, by the time you look at it, whether it's Tuesday morning, Tuesday afternoon, Tuesday evening, the line closes or whenever you bet it, it's plus 125. Now, Shell, you're sitting there going like, I'm still getting plus money. Like, what's the difference between plus 135 and 125? I'm only betting 10, 20 bucks at a time. Like, I just want action on this game. Well, if your average instead of 135 is now plus 125, and you're still having those same results because we're all still betting the same game, right? I'm betting it at plus 135. You're betting it at plus 125. I'm going 320 and 400. You're going 320 and 400. Well, you know what happens when your average is plus 125 on 320 wins? You win 400. Well, the problem is your outlay is 400 as well. So you are break-even guy. So I'm sitting over here just making it rain, and you're a break-even guy, and we made the exact same bet except for the price difference. And you're saying to yourself, again, plus 125, plus 135. When you're betting something at plus 125 and not plus 135, your win probability goes from 44.4 to 42.6. That's 1.8%, right? That doesn't feel like a lot. Right? It's just 1.8%. Like, who cares, right? Like, that's, am I leasing a car? That sounds like financing at that point. But like, if you've leased a car, then you know that 1.8% matters over the long term. Other examples of a 1.8% difference, plus 235 versus plus 215. Again, you're sitting there, you're making a bet, you're going, oh, it's plus 200. Like, man, I'm getting better than 2-1 on this bet. I think these teams are closer to even than people think, and blah, 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 blah. I'm fine with taking the plus 215. Well, like, what if 235 was available last night? What if it was available an hour ago, right? That's part of this difference. Another difference, minus 150 to minus 162, right? Whether it's Final Four money line, NFL money line, you're throwing together a parlay. Please don't parlay unless you're doing crazy underdog round robin money line parlays for fun. Minus 162 and minus 150 doesn't feel like it's that much of a difference. Guess what? It's 1.8%, right? It's the difference between averaging 135 and averaging 125 over the course of 720 bets. But since this is a game-to-game sport, right? These money line sports that we talk about, they're game-to-game. The result is you either win or you lose. This team wins or this team loses. It's different than a point spread, right? It's easier to parse that when a game lands on 7, when the line is 7.5. Right? Whether it's basketball, you and I talk about football, key numbers, the percentage of the time. It's very easy to explain to people when a line goes from 7 to 7.5, how that changes your likelihood of cashing that ticket versus just getting a push. It's easy to sort of understand your win and loss, but like, oh, this team can win, but maybe not by that much, right? It's also easy to believe that the 7.5 point favorite can win by 6, can win by 7, and the underdog still wins the bet. It's very easy to make that bet, right? Everybody says too many points. That's the catchphrase, if you will, right? Value, too many points, right? But do people really understand the difference between, what did I just say? Plus 215 and plus 235, plus 125 and plus 135, minus 150 and minus 162? Are people out there telling you the difference between those values? Are they talking about value in that context? They are not, because we talk about basketball, we talk about football, and point spreads are easier conversations to have, and they're easier bets to make. And it ends up becoming like versus knowing what it means when you lose $15 or $16. Right? Or winning just 25 when you probably should have won 27 on a $20 bet. Like that type of stuff, like on a night-to-night basis. Like, did I win my bet? Yes. Did I win 25? Sweet, right? But over 720 bets, that $2 added up, right? If you are making $2 more per bet than you otherwise would be, or even per win, right? Even the 320 wins. If you're winning $2 more on 320 wins, do some quick math, that's $640, right? Just because you price shopped. And so what the article does is it tells you like, okay, maybe you didn't get the best price, but are you still making a valuable bet here? And if plus 160, if it was 170, but now it's 160, but it's still a valuable bet down to plus 150, okay, fire away, because you're going to end up profitable over the course of 720 games. When if you don't, you might not, right? Maybe you end up being break-even guy. Maybe you're even worse and you end up being lose a little bit of money guy. Maybe you end up being lose a lot of money type guy, right? Price shopping matters. And it isn't just in the NFL and the NBA where, or in college basketball, where point spread decides, okay, I got plus 6, you got plus 7. There's a chance here that like, I'm going to lose, but you're going to win. If we're all betting the money line, we all either win or we lose. And where the edges are is in how much we're losing and how much we're winning. And that's what's reflected in the money line. And so that's what we're going to do. We're doing that every day from now until the end of the regular season. Obviously, the Stanley Cup playoffs going to be a lot different from that standpoint, because obviously matchups and all that sort of thing get into the mix there as well. But that is now a daily thing. Obviously, Friday, we'll have the full weekend and that sort of thing. So yeah, just wanted to talk a little hockey before we actually get into sort of the stretch run here with the NHL, because obviously we're pretty close to the NBA playoffs. That's going to be exciting, but we're going to have a 2-month stretch here where it's all NBA and all NHL playoffs back and forth sort of every single night. It's going to be outstanding.
Definitely. And very interesting to deep dive into the numbers and understanding just how to add more value to your bets on a daily basis, especially if you are doing this on a daily basis. So always love those deep dives. And also when we get to finding out more information and where people can find the information that you put out on a daily basis now, where would people be able to find said information?
Yeah, man, that's at MRoss Authentic on Twitter. Yesterday was an electric day for like really, really weird reasons. We had the match play going on. We had the match play all weekend. Mm-hmm. I had kind of a low-key rough start to that tournament on the Wednesday and Thursday. Got it going again Friday and Saturday. Nobody really cares about that sort of thing. But the fun part was yesterday, you get a couple of matchups early in the morning and that decides the final. And the funniest part was Dustin Johnson. He loses, I think it was on the last hole, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe not. It's all sort of a jumble to me at this point, but he loses in the semifinals on the last hole. And if you know anything about Dustin Johnson, right? Like the difference between the third place check and the fourth place check, not relevant in Dustin Johnson's world, right? He is here to win tournaments and fly on private jets and go hang out with his family. Like that's what Dustin Johnson does. And so like anybody who follows golf, and it's funny because the golf media was making jokes about this, and that's the difference between sort of traditional media and sports bettors, where we are on top of this type of stuff in a more meaningful, actionable way, if you will. And Corey Connors and Kevin Kisner were battling away there in the other semifinal. And I tweeted out, I was like, this is the best because Dustin Johnson is not going to care about this, anything that's called a consolation match. Dustin Johnson's not going to care about. And it's like, it's a relatively quick turnaround, but you'll have time to literally whoever loses between Kisner and Connors, bet on that guy. And one, you're going to be getting value. You're going to be getting a plus price. Now, back in the old days, before everybody knew this, before the mainstream media was on to Dustin Johnson probably not caring about this match, we probably would have gotten a better price than the plus 120 that we ended up getting on Corey Connors. And honestly, if it had been Kisner, probably would have even be like a little bit of a worse price because of people's respect for Kevin Kisner. But I digress. And so Connors, plus 120, like auto bet, biggest bet of the entire match. So you've got all these matches, all of this tournament happening, and the biggest bet is the one that's called the consolation match because, DJ is not going to be super locked in. And Shell, what happens? DJ loses the first 3 holes. He is down 3 through 3. Now pride ends up kicking in. And by the way, Dustin Johnson, when not caring, is probably a top 5 talent in golf, right? Like he's still going to be pretty good. It's just, you're now going to have to mount a comeback on, 3 up on a guy, Corey Connors, playing great golf. Really, speaking of guys who care about the difference between the 4th place check and the 3rd place check, right? We're not talking about the rich of the rich, so to speak here. We're not talking about major champions. So you're going to get every effort for all 18 holes from Corey Connors. So easiest bet to make, easiest one to see coming down the tracks, fun to get that out on Twitter at least, so that hopefully somebody stumbles on it and goes, wait a sec, DJ's playing in a meaningless golf match, fade. While all that's happening, and this is the absolute tip podcast of all tips here, and this isn't rocket science by any means, dabbling in the F1 scene from a betting standpoint. And because the race, I was going to call it the match, the race started at 1:00 Eastern time, had plenty of time on my hands. Time can be a little dangerous from time to time. Sometimes it works out pretty good. So I'm starting to look through the matchups, which I don't normally do when it comes to the F1. And I'm checking all these different matchups. And I'm actually comparing lines from site to site because I see one matchup, and we're getting deep into the weeds here, but Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda was a matchup. They're teammates. A lot of these matchups are often teammates. And Yuki in this one website was like plus 450 to win that matchup. And I'm like, well, that number doesn't seem right. And so I start looking at other odds for that same matchup at different books. And the other ones had Gasly at minus 400. Well, Shell, I don't have to tell you, minus 400 plus 450, we're in the free money zone right there, right? Like you can either even that out so that you win no matter what happens, or you can free roll one guy or the other. Obviously, I'm going to free roll the underdog here in an F1 race because from the little that I know about F1, I know that Pierre Gasly could find himself in a wall here on the first lap and Yuki's going to win by default. So I make this bet. I put as much as I can on Yuki. I put as much as I can on Gasly. And so now I am free rolling a few $100. If Yuki can beat his teammate, again, no risk on this, right? Because if Gasly wins, I break even. If he can beat this teammate, I win multiple hundreds of dollars on an F1 race. Again, something that I do not bet seriously. And otherwise I'm betting, sort of $20 at a time here just to sort of try to get this F1 thing figured out because it's pretty tricky. I literally turn on, I haven't even watched any of the pre-race show. I turn the pre-race show on, and the first image I see, Shell, is pre-race. My guy Yuki is sitting in his car on the side of the road by himself, wondering what's happened to his engine or his whatever, right? Like, I don't know. I'm like, really? The first thing I see, you're laughing. The first thing I see is my guy Yuki just waiting for somebody, sadly, to come pick him up, right? He's just like, can somebody please get me? And I'm like, Ukes, you're not even going to start the race, man? Like, what are we doing, brother? Come on. And so what happens is, first of all, I shrug and I go, well, I guess Gasly's going to win this matchup and I'm going to break even. Not the end of the world, but like, I was really excited to watch this like low to mid-level race here for 11th place between these two guys.
And they like, probably had the feed where you could just watch those two drivers, right? Like,
and honestly,
shit like that.
By like the fourth lap, I probably would have been like deep dark webbing for something along those lines. Yeah. Luckily, you at least have the thing on the side that shows you the order of guys, and I would have been locked in on that. Wouldn't have even known who won the race. I would have been so locked into that potentially. But I was excited for the sweat. I was like, oh, this is gonna be fun. Like free rolling a sweat. Like this is amazing. It's not unlike the Arkansas Duke situation. I'm like, okay, that sucks. I really wanted to just see what was going to happen there. And then I check the book, and my first thing I want to make sure is like, okay, let's make sure the Yuki bet, or like the Gasly bet isn't voided because Yuki's not starting. Okay, well, that still seems to be running. That's fine. Okay, it hasn't been voided. I look over at my Yuki bet, and it's voided before the race even starts. And so now I only have one bet out there of this, of this balanced book, so to speak, that I have, because the loss has been voided. Mm-hmm. So now all I need is them to just keep this bet alive, because it's going to win. Obviously, he's the only guy in the race, right? Yeah. And so I'm just sitting there. So now I have a free roll on this Gasly bet. So instead of wanting Yuki to win, I just want Gasly to win. Obviously, he is going to win, but not even win. I just need this bet to be honored at this point. So now, Shell, the sweat isn't on the race. I'm not watching the race. I'm watching the sports book, and I'm refreshing. Is it still there? Yep. Still pending. Still pending. Watch the race for a little while. Let's check on it again. Yep. Still pending. Shall the race ends? Still pending. They start paying out winner. They're paying out first guy to crash. I hit that one, by the way, 14-1 on Latifi for a cool $80. Again, I'm not exactly going nuts on these Formula One bets. I end up, like I said, watching the first basketball game. I check after that game's done, still pending. The race has been over for multiple hours at this point. I go out, and like I said, had a few wings, a couple of beers. I check after that. Shell, it's still pending. We watched the Oscars last night. Shell, it is still pending. They haven't decided. This has turned into a 12+ hour sweat on whether this sportsbook is going to honor this bet or not. And Shell, to be completely honest with you, because I'm an honorable guy, I don't even think they should. I've already seen another book void it, right? So what's the word I'm looking for here? The precedent is set with this other book voiding it. So I'm not going to be surprised when they void it. It's more like, well, how sweet would it be if they actually let this go through? It took them till this morning, right before we came on this podcast, for them to void the bet. And so I just did like an 18-hour sweat about whether or not this sportsbook was going to void this bet. So all of this is to say, know the rules, right? Because if I had known going in, and now that I know that if you don't start the race, according to this book and according to that book, now maybe this other book might have a different rule, and we'll see down the line if something like this happens. But these are the questions that people are asking me on Twitter. They're like, do you know how they're going to grade this? Tell me how they're going to grade this. Like, tell me how your book grades this, because that's the issues that we have, right? And sometimes these things are a little bit more nefarious. Again, this one, I was like, I thought I was going to get away with one there, because let's be honest, sports books are getting away with some hand over fist on us out there as well. But yeah, just kind of a weird story, a weird situation, but at the same time, I think somewhat instructive that like people need to know what the rules are. And again, as somebody just starting out betting F1 in the last year or two, some circumstances happen. Like my guy Yuki just sitting sadly on the side of the road sends everything into an absolute spiral. The good news is, again, my Latifi thing cashed because Yuki wasn't retired from the race. He just never made it to the race. Again, new sport, new rules. Again, if you're just getting into betting hockey, and usually that's, cut and dry. if you're getting into another, sport, something along those lines, right? Try to know the rules as best you can, but sometimes you just can't know everything that's happening.
Hey, you can only know so much, right? You can only know so much. But again, right. Follow along at MRussAuthentic for the adventures in sports betting for sure, as that continues on a daily basis, just as much as the Coach K farewell tour continues to, just hurting my feelings. But either way, thanks for joining me on this ride, my dude. Appreciate you stopping by.
Love it, man. Thanks so much.
Thanks to Matt for coming on the pod. And if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander and on Twitter at Shell Alexander. Don't forget to like and subscribe to DRF Sports Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also rate us, review us, like us, all that other fun stuff. But for more from this new project from DRF Sports, just a little reminder, if you're unfamiliar with the letters DRF, it stands for Daily Racing Forum, which has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now we've taken over the entire sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game, as well as the NBA, MLB, college sports, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights, as the site has all of the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, team stats, and more. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want access to all of the raw data, drf.com/sports. That's where you can find the usual previews as we deep dive into the games. And of course, got you covered on this podcast. However you want your betting information, we've got you covered. Again, my name is Sheldon Alexander. That's all I got for now. But until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.